My name is Tyson Raper. I'm the cotton and small grain specialist for the University of Tennessee. Very happy to have Nutifafa Adotey here with me today. He's our extension soil fertility specialist. He's going to be talking a little bit about nitrogen loss mechanisms and the impact of source and rate on nitrogen loss. And then we're going to shift gears, move locations, and talk a little bit about potassium. But to kind of kick things off, Fafa, can you talk to us a little bit about where we are, what we're standing in front of right now?
Sure. This afternoon, we're looking at a study that I'm conducting, looking at different nitrogen rates and looking at different effects of nitrogen applications rate as well as different nitrogen sources on cotton yield. And this is very important because when we put out nitrogen fertilizer, there is possibility for nitrogen loss, and there are various forms. One of the forms is ammonia volatilization. And this is pretty much when you put out your surface applied urea or UAN and you don't incorporate that nitrogen source into the soil. If you leave it sitting out there, there is the conversion of that urea source to, or that nitrogen in your urea to ammonia, which escapes to the environment. And the question has always been, we know there is a loss. The question is, how much do you lose? And one of the things this study did was to capture the potential ammonia, the potential nitrogen that is lost as ammonia.
So Fafa, in the study, it looks like we've got rate evaluated on part of this, and then we've got source evaluated on the other side. Your rate is 0.50 and 150 pounds.
That's
all
correct.
applied as urea.
Yes.
And then what are we looking at on the source side?
On the sources, we're looking at just urea, untreated urea with any kind of urease inhibitors. And we also have liquid UAN, untreated liquid UAN, and we have a polymer coated urea fertilizer, ESN. So these are the sources we are looking at.
And in the source part of the study, what rate did you use to evaluate those sources?
And this, they were applied at 90 pounds units of nitrogen per acre. So each of these sources was applied at 90.
Well, Fafa, one of the really interesting parts of the data that you've shared with me on the rate side of things is it seems like we have higher loss when we apply more. Is that correct?
Correct. That's what we saw. And typically we saw somewhere between twice the potential ammonia loss once we increased the rate from 50 to 100. We saw it almost doubled. That's what we see from the data.
Fafa, why does that loss rate increase when we have a higher amount of nitrogen applied?
Yes, because what happens is when you put out a lot of that urea fertilizer together, once you have urea hydrolysis occurring, that is, urea hydrolysis is when your urea breaks down in the presence of moisture, temperature, and adequate and urease enzyme. So what happens is that the pH increases, and because the pH increases, the rate of breakdown is faster because you have more of that nitrogen available in the soil.
Well, so what would your take home be on the rate side of this study?
Yes, it's very important. My take home, the biggest take home message is that when you are putting out a higher rate, maybe you have a higher yielding cotton and you are putting out higher rates of nitrogen, it's very important, if you're not going to get rainfall, to at least try to treat that urea with a urease inhibitor to minimize that losses. And we have the losses occurring within the first 7 days. So it's very important to take care of that, to minimize your loss by treating your urea. So the more you put out, the more important it is to treat that urea-based fertilizer source.
And what you're talking about here, from a percent loss standpoint, at our, let's say we're applying 100 pounds per acre, what might our percent loss be if we're not using a treatment on that urea?
Okay, so one thing we also have to keep in mind is that the losses depends on a whole lot of factors. But the study we conducted based on our conditions, what we saw is that we had about 11% nitrogen loss. And the interesting thing is that we had about somewhere between 70% of that loss occurring within the first 7 days. That's why it's very critical, that early window application. The losses, to point out, the study we did was for 21 days. But then within the first 7 days or a week into our study, we had a chunk or a significant of our losses occurring. So that is very important to note. We had about 11% loss, but most of them occurred within the first 7 days.
So, Fafa, for as far as take home on the source side of this experiment, what do we learn?
Okay, so the first thing we saw over that 21-day period is that the highest ammonia loss occurred from untreated urea, which was about 17% of the total nitrogen that we put out. So if you put out 100 units of nitrogen, you are losing about 17 units. And then we saw that UAN had about 13%, and the UAN was knifed in. It had about 13% nitrogen loss. And ESN had the least amount of loss, which was about 5%.
So, Fafa, as you know, we apply a lot of urea in the state. I've got concerns from a uniform application standpoint. A lot of times we'll have some streaking as humidity changes throughout the day, or if we're trying to apply too far. But this data looks like beyond just applying more uniformly with UAN, we could also potentially reduce loss with a UAN product.
Correct. And yes, we can reduce loss significantly with the knife in or the UAN product, and more so if we treat that UAN with a urease inhibitor. There is possibility for lower losses too.
So, Fafa, can you explain a little bit about how weather might have impacted the responses that we saw, and if weather could have maybe changed those?
Exactly, sure. Thank you. Great question. So when we have our urea sitting on the surface, if there is a rainfall, what it does is that rainfall incorporates that urea into the soil. Once it's incorporated into the soil, that gas is not does not escape. So we have lower ammonia volatilization losses. However, in my study, when we put out the nitrogen applications, we didn't have any rainfall. So that may explain why we had higher nitrogen losses, and that's something to look into. Thank you.
Excellent, Fafa. Thanks. So, Fafa, I also wanted to talk a little today about potassium. And from what I've seen, I think potassium is very well the most yield-restricting nutrient for us in West Tennessee in cotton production. We're starting to see a lot of deficiencies this year. Why do you think that might be?
Yes. So there are a few reasons. There are several reasons. To begin with, the intensity as well as the frequency and cotton is a little bit higher or frequent compared to other row crops, and pretty much it boils down to a few factors. The first being that the cotton plant is inefficient in taking up that potassium compared to those other row crops. Why? Because of its root. It has a less dense root, or it has lower root density. So the uptake is a little bit slow. Also, right when the cotton plant needs that potassium, the root growth stops. And we have root growth stops, okay. And then there's also the point about stratification, where that potassium is in the soil, but it's not moving down the soil profile where the roots can get to it. Because potassium is not a nutrient that moves, it's not mobile in the soil. One other factor is that it's just weather or weather-related problem, and that is rainfall. So we may have potassium in the soil, but if there's not enough moisture, the plant is not able to take up that potassium. Remember I said potassium doesn't move. So if there's not enough water to send potassium to the plant by diffusion, the plant will not take it up. And then you begin to see symptoms like this when you have interveinal chlorosis, which moves or progresses to the yellowing of the leaves along the margin. Eventually, you have the leaves edges dying off, or what we call necrosis. We're here because this is an experiment that is being conducted by Dr. Shikufa, and she was looking at impact of rainfall on cotton yield. But in this rainout shelter, which did not receive enough rain, we could see that the potassium is in the same rate of potassium under the shelter as well as the rain fed and irrigated. But what we are saying is that the plant is not able to take it up. So it's in the soil, but it's not available for the plant because the plant cannot take it up. The water, that carrier that potassium needs for the plant to take, that the plant needs, there's not enough water in the soil to take it up. So that's one.
So if we get into a situation like this, do we have any ways to really address potassium uptake?
Yes, recently or a few years back, I was looking at the data that a specialist, Dr. Yin, did here. And what he did was he looked at foliar potassium fertilizer in a study. And what he saw was that he got about 250 pounds of length yield by applying foliar application. So yes, there is a possibility or there's potential of foliar fertilizers helping with length yield as well as fiber quality. But factors like time of application, weather, they are all factors that influence the efficiency of foliar. So yes, foliar fertilizer can be a way to correct this late season potassium deficiency we see.
Fafa, let's talk a little bit about the cost of that foliar application and the quantity that we would need to potentially create yield increase from a foliar.
Okay, so since foliar application may not contain enough potassium as your soil applied, there's the need for multiple application, at least 2 and if possible 3 different application times as well to cover for the amount of potassium that is required by the plant. One other useful thing about foliar application is it can be combined with other growth regulators or other...
like a maintenance application?
Yeah.
Good deal. Yeah. Well, Fafa, thanks so much for sharing a little bit about what we're seeing in the field from a potassium uptake standpoint.
Okay.